Hi, I'm Fel the Blythe, and I'm on a beach. So this video is going to be a little bit different, and a little bit of the same. Honestly, that should be a subtitle for all my videos. Hi, I'm Fel the Blythe. A little bit different, and a little bit the same. I'm trying some new things stylistically, but also I'm on vacation, so obviously this is not where I live, and not where probably most of my other videos are going to be, unless I come down here next year as well. Before I get into today's video, there's a couple of things that I want to acknowledge. Number one, this video is about connecting with the land. Given that I am an American, the land that I'm on is not my own, and has never been my own and will never be my own. So I want to acknowledge the people who are on this land and were on this land before me. I believe that in order to honor the land, especially as someone on the American continents, on Turtle Island, that it is important for me to acknowledge first whose land I am on. I'm currently on the land of the Kusabo people, which is an island alliance of the Ishpao, the Kombahi, the Kuso, the Edisto, the Escamaku, the Etawan, Stono, Boheket, Wando, Wapo, Wimbi, and Kiowa tribes. Today, this is still the land of the Etawan and Kuso people. Below, I will share some links to the Landback movement, as well as how to learn about whose land you are on if you live in the North and South American continents. So the second thing I want to mention, speaking of honoring the land and helping the land when it is in need, I want to mention is how to support the wildfires that are currently happening in Greece. For those of you who don't know, climate change-induced wildfires have spread across a lot of Greece and taken untold damage and harm. And local firefighters and displaced people are not getting the help that they need. I'll share some places to donate to below that were shared with me from people in Greece. If you can't donate money, sharing the donation pages helps as well. So, now that I've talked a little bit about honoring the land and the people who are on this land and were on this land before you, as well as helping the land when it is in need, I want to talk about nymphs. That's what this video is all about. A sort of an introduction to the worship of nymphs. Nymphs are my dearly beloveds. I love them so much. They are actually one of the reasons that I first got into Hellenism in the first place. Actually, I would say they are the reason that I came to Hellenism in the first place. That whole story is a story for a different time. I'll probably get into it at some point. I plan on making a how did I get here video, but they are very important to me. Me calling them beloved nymphs is not just me pulling things out of thin air. They are actually to his beloved nymphs and dear nymphs in several dedications, as the nymphs were considered closer a lot of times. What even are nymphs? That's actually a bit of a complicated discussion. It depends on what nymphs you are referring to. There's nymphs that were considered primordial daughters of Proteus. There's the Oceanids of the god Oceanus. There are the nymphs that are the daughters of Zeus. Still, there are other nymphs that are daughters of local river gods and nymphs of other gods as well. So pretty much the nymphs are, their genealogy really diverse and different, and it's kind of like, bleh. Nymphs inhabit trees, mountains, meadows, water, any natural location, essentially. Are they deities? Yes. Ish. They're not deities in what many people would consider deities in our modern eye. They're more like nature spirits. Many times they're referred to as minor nature deities. So they are divine, but not in the way that we conceptualize as like the big gods, TM. They're also similar to daemons. Daemons are daemons, not demons, in that they are the personification of nature. So they are the thing, but they also live there. It's very complicated. I'm sure I've confused you, and, well, nymphs have confused scholars for centuries, and I don't think we're gonna understand anymore now. Speaking of confusing, I'm gonna do a brief overview of the types of nymphs, because where there is nature, there are nymphs. Whether it's an individual plant or a natural area in general, there's a nymph. Here's a quote from the Greek cult of nymphs at Corinth by Theodora Kopestonsky. The lives of nymphs can be intrinsically tied to a particular spring, tree, or grove. If these are destroyed, the nymph dies. The nymphs are a plural divinity, that is, they are very often depicted in groups, usually of 3, rather than a single entity. That has been my own personal experience with nymphs as well. So the nymphs oftentimes are not just worshipped as one thing, they're often worshipped as a group. But I'll get into that later. So anyway, Types of nymphs. Let's roll some lists. Shout out to theoi.com for organizing them really clearly. I'll link that article below. I've shuffled some things around and removed some things, but this is the list that I'm basically following. Freshwater nymphs. The Oceanids or Oceanides were the eldest of the nymphs, daughters of the great earth-encircling river Oceanus. So freshwater, ocean. Well, ocean, Oceanus, was actually an earth-encircling river, not an ocean. So the Oceanids preside over the sources of fresh water. Second, we have the Naiads. Naiads were nymphs of earthly sources of fresh water. So that would be springs, rivers, streams, wells, and fountains. Some were also Oceanids, while others were born of local river gods. Tree and forest nymphs. Nymphs number 3, Dryads. Dryads were the nymphs of trees, forests, and groves. Some dryads were also naiads, which happened to preside over the trees growing by the spring, while others were Oreades, or Oreads, the mountain nymphs, connected to the highland-growing firs and manna ash trees. Discord. We need to exit Discord. Confuses people, and me, when I edit. Then there are the Hamadryads. Hamadryads were dryads whose life force was bound to a specific tree. So they were often paired with the loftiest tree in a grove, and some were also naiads of springs, in particular those which sprouted from the roots of a tree. So now we have number 5. I don't know if I said that was number 4. This is number 5. The Melii were nymphs of the mountain ash and honeybees. Oh, I love the Melii and the Melissae. The Melissae, also known Melissa, that's where that name comes from, were nymphs of honeybees. I love these guys. They're so cool. I don't know. I just love bees. They're so neat. The meadow and marsh nymphs. The Amphimolides, were nymphs of pastures who nourished herds of cattle, goats, and sheep which grazed their land. They were also nymphs of orchards. Cheese was sacred to them, which I just think is real cool. The Lemonids, or the Lemonides, were the nymphs of flowery water meadows. The Anthusi were the nymphs of flowers in general. The sky and star nymphs. The Nephili were the nymphs of rain clouds. Auri were nymphs of cool breezes. The Hesperides, which you might have heard before. The Hesperides were nymphs of sunsets. They were the daughters of Hesperos, the evening star. The Asterai were nymphs of the stars in general. Most were daughters of Atlas, including the Pleiades, which is a constellation many people know today. And now the sea nymphs, some of our most famous kinds of nymphs. The Halii were nymphs of sea and shore. They were spirits of the deep, the waves, fish, coastal caverns, sandy beaches, rocks, and pebbly shores. A few were also naiad nymphs who guided freshwater streams through the sea. And then the Nereids, were nymphs of the sea in general. Those are the most common names that you will hear is Nereids or Nereids. Okay. Underworld nymphs. These are very cool. The Lampades were the torch-bearing nymphs of the underworld. They formed a train of the goddesses Persephone and Hecate. Many underworld nymphs were described as daughters of infernal rivers like the river Styx. Other types of nymphs. We have the Maenads, probably heard of before. They are the train of the god Dionysus, and often consorted with the satyrs. Most notably, which I find fascinating, in text, there's also acknowledgement of foreign nymphs, meaning that the existence of nymphs goes beyond physical boundaries. There were nymphs of the Nile. There were Covetina's well in Roman Britain. There was Sabrina, the nymph of the river Severn. So here's some honorable nymph mentions, just because I think they're cool. The Syrinxes, which were nymphs of the reeds. Lairopi, lilies. The Ionides, nymphs of violets. The Rhodos, nymphs of roses. And the Pterides, nymphs of ferns. I just think they're cool because they're super specific. Here are some worship considerations about nymphs because they are unique. I've nicknamed this section because I just think nymphs are real cool. To me, what is so special about nymph worship is how personal their worship is. The cult of the nymphs were sacred to women, the poor, immigrants, refugees, those who were homeless, enslaved individuals, children, foreigners, and more. Nymph cults were often small and local, rural and sublime, quite the exact opposite of patriarchal, aristocratic Attic religion. Each nymph cult had its own personal style of worship, which is why reconstructing it is quite different than other topics that I've touched on. Devotionalism was also an important part of nymph cults. Here's a quote from Jennifer Larson about devotionalism in nymph cults. Devotionalism also implies an emotional, not merely intellectual apprehension of the divine. Participation in group rituals, such as processions or sacrifices, may partake of devotionalism insofar as the individual's sense of personal relationship with the deity is engaged. She goes on to showcase a dedication found in Aristophanes' Thesmophoria. I entreat Hermes, Nomoios, and Pan, and the dear nymphs. How I called them beloved nymphs earlier. That goes into devotionalism. There was a nympholet, someone who was dedicated entirely to the nymphs. I'll talk about a little bit about nympholepsy later. This nympholet filled a cave to a specific nymph, and dedications referred to her as his sister, and also as a daughter. In another poetry fragment, a dedicant once referred to a local nymph as Mother Aegina. Nymph worship is very personal, but while our personal praxis with nymphs is individual to us, does not mean that there aren't cues we can take from ancient history. Let's get started on some of those cues and traditions of nymph worship that we can find. Altars and sacred spaces. If you'll remember in my altar, shrines, and sacred spaces video, I mentioned that an altar could be as simple as 3 stones placed on top of each other out in nature. Well, what I didn't say then, as what I will say now, is that that altar that I'm specifically referring to is an example of an altar to a nymph. Many times a natural space or formation, such as a cave, a rock, a waterfall, would become an altar itself. This and the surrounding space would then be referred to as the gardens of the nymphs. Altars and shrines to nymphs were often at the site where a nymph was thought to live, but it is certainly not unheard of for nymphs to have actual temples that weren't just natural paradise things, and they would actually share altars with other deities. Or have their own altar within another deity's temenos, their sacred space. That's another thing that makes nymphs so special, is that nymphs were often worshipped in groups or in tandem with other gods. Another thing that makes nymphs special is their offerings, and also kind of how you set up their sacred space, in that they don't fit neatly into chthonic or Uranic categories, which is very surprising given that crossover between chthonic and Uranic deities were often seen as very taboo. This is not the case with nymphs. Interestingly enough, we see both. A lot of it depends on the type of nymph and your personal relationship with them. There's certainly evidence of nymphs being treated as chthonic deities with underground grottos, but then there was evidence of, in those underground chthonic spaces, of having Uranic offerings in which the meal was shared with the nymph. So a lot of that goes into your personal relationship with them. Anything natural is sacred to nymphs, but some special places, those considered more liminal, are often a good place to commune with the nymphs. Mountains, riverbank, caves, big rocks, the foot of a tree, especially if it's very far tucked out in nature. Nymphs are very rural, they're very nature-oriented. That's not to say there aren't nymphs of the city. I certainly believe that there are, but it's easier to connect with them the deeper in nature you are and the more removed you are from so-called civilization. If you'd like to make your own special shrine to the nymph, I'm actually going to do a little bit of how I set up my temporary shrine to the nymphs at the end of this video. If you want to set up a more permanent one, or learn how to make a travel one, be sure to check out my altar, shrines, and sacred spaces video. That should be over here, because much of those same conversations apply here. Although, as I said for the first time in one of my videos, the chthonic-Uranic distinction is not all that vital. Offerings. In my All About Offerings video, I go over all you could ever hope to learn and more about how to make offerings. So go check that out for basic offering format and structure. I will not really be covering that here. Instead, I'm going to cover what makes offerings unique to nymphs and also certain things that are special to them. As I mentioned, nymphs are one of the few times that we see a mixture of Uranic and chthonic elements in offerings, meaning that while sometimes the whole is left for them and other times it is shared. So these offerings would often be left out in nature to let nature consume it. Obviously only do this if you're sure that it won't harm the environment or don't want to attract pests to your home, but that was one of the most common ways, was to leave it out in nature and literally let nature consume it. Votive offerings, especially clay dolls, are one of the most common offerings found dedicated to nymphs. Songs and poetry are other strong contenders. The classic offerings of wine, milk, oil, and honey are of course seen for nymphs, with milk, honey, and specifically fragrant oil being some of the most common. Specifically, other important offerings are cheese, bread, seeds, flowers, statues, often made of wood or clay, offerings from the natural habitat, seashells, stones, etc. All of those are attested. Nymphs were often left votives of miniature offering vessels, which I think is very cool. I actually think I showed my mini amphora jug in one of my videos. They would have it filled with a drop of honey or oil to replicate the larger offering, which I just love miniatures. Similarly to heroes, water was actually a very common offering to nymphs, especially water that was rare in that area. So if you were at the sea, water drawn from a fresh spring, or if you had a fresh spring, water drawn from the sea. Offerings to nymphs also sometimes evoked kind of a sympathetic magic. In the Greek cult of nymphs at Corinth, it is mentioned that a figurine of a boy was found offered by a mother, likely indicating either her wish to have a baby or in thanks for having a child. Nymphs are often seen as caretakers of children and caretakers of mothers, brides. We can also see kind of some aspects of sympathetic magic being evoked in offerings to the nymphs. One of my personal favorite ways to honor nymphs is to honor the land that I am on, and not only honor it, but to clean it up, to remove invasive species, tend a garden, and getting to know my local native plants. Supporting the land around you is quite literally supporting the lives of the nymphs. Nymphs, while they tend to live longer than humans, are often not seen as immortal, so you need to care for the land around you in order to care for, quite literally, the nymphs and sustain them and keep them alive. Offerings, again, uniquely, were not always made just to one nymph, sometimes a group of nymphs, as well as oftentimes being shared with another deity. There's a dedication to Hermes and the nymphs in as far back as the Odyssey, and those dedications to nymphs, one nymph, multiple nymphs, and nymphs with gods are continued to be seen up into the Hellenistic and Roman periods, and actually even a little bit beyond. Touched a little bit on this earlier. Nympholets. Nympholets, or Nympholepsy. So Nympholepsy, also translating to seized by the nymphs, is an experience in which a person seems to leave themselves. They are transported physically, mentally, and spiritually by the nymphs, oftentimes accompanied by visions and prophecy. Nympholepsy could be experienced by anyone, although I will say nympholets were usually male, but whatever, it's a modern day and age, do what you want. In fact, the concept of being seized by the nymphs has lasted into the modern day with the Greek Nerida. Someone, please correct me where I'm pronouncing that. The Nerida, which is a nature spirit still believed in Greece today, whose direct ancestor is the nymph. I'm probably going to do a deep dive into nympholepsy at some point, because I'm going to be honest, I'm on vacation, I haven't gotten much time to really dive into nympholepsy, and I really want to get into it because it's fascinating. I've never personally experienced it. I've met people who have. The idea is that people would go to, usually deep out into nature, the shade of a tree, a certain time of day, and they would have a very spiritual experience with nature. And some of these people would just treasure that forever, and others would become nympholets, dedicating themselves entirely to nymphs. They would leave their homes, literally leave their homes, leave their professions, leave their families, and just live in a cave to worship the nymphs. Nymphs were considered prophetic and ideal to do divination with. When folks could not see the Oracle of Delphi, they would often go to nymph shrines or nymphaeum. These were often done in conjunction with Hermes. I'll do a whole thing on divination in Hellenism, and I'll also do a deep dive into nympholepsy in general, but it's a fun concept. I'm excited to learn more about it. Modern considerations. Nymph worship is one of the most fulfilling and just awe-inspiring forms of worship that I have ever experienced. Nymphs were what drew me to Hellenism in the first place, and they continue to refresh me. Engaging with the natural land around me continues to invigorate me. I'll walk you through how I set up a temporary altar here, an offering here, to the nymphs, and how I invited them into my vacation and the week here I spent on the beach.
The beach is full of treasures, and that's the place that I started to build my altar. There were trinkets around and shops that spoke to me, and I decided to grab them to use for my temporary altar to the nymphs. I cleaned up the space where I was going to set up my altar, and I had purchased a candle at one of the local shops and used some of the things that were in the place we were staying to sort of house them. First, I melted down the bottom of my candle, which I then anointed with a certain kind of oil that I had, and I prayed over the candle before lighting it. Once I had lit it, I decided to open the space and do a traditional offering of bay leaves. Here's a glimpse of my altar in its entirety. I had a little bit of seeds from a pepper that you saw, and a trinket, a little dish that held some of the items I wanted blessed. Over the next few days, I let it burn down all the way and eventually released all the offerings back to where they came from.
I hope you learned something about nymphs that you did not know before, and I hope you look into the trees around you a little more closely. You might feel something that you just cannot name. Before I close out, be sure to check out the links in the description to learn about the land that you live on, and make sure to support Greece throughout these wildfires. Again, all those will be in the description. Next time you see me, I'll be back home, but until then, I hope you're surviving this August heat, and I'll see you in the next one. We're getting serenaded by a lovely nature spirit here. Anyway. Okay then. Bye-bye.